Ed is an executive leader and coach. He's a speaker, pastor, and he is an incredible encourager. He is currently the board chair for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship USA, and most recently served as campus pastor for Willow Creek, Chicago's North Shore Church. And so he just left that in the last couple of months. Ed is married to Marcia, and they have 3 children, Leah, Kayla, and Micah. Please welcome Ed and John. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm reminded in moments like this of just a small statement my dad used to say oftentimes. He said, stand up to be seen, speak up to be heard, and then quickly sit down to be appreciated. So I get to just be a tour guide, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Just so you know, we haven't rehearsed this beforehand. John, in fact, didn't want to see any of my questions beforehand because he wanted it to be an authentic dialogue, not because he didn't want to talk with me. So it's good to be together. Let me just share a little bit about John, because when you know someone, oftentimes you can take for granted the things that have happened in their life that have brought them to this moment. And so I'm going to use the bio and then say a couple words. And so good to see you, Ned Hill. John Inazu is a Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at the Washington University in St. Louis. My wife did her PhD studies there. Her latest book is His latest book is Learning to Disagree: The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. John's also the author of Liberty's Refuge: The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly. That's in 2002 or 2012, I should say, and The Confident Pluralism, which is something that I want to get a little bit of conversation about: Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. He's a co-editor with someone who's meant a lot to the lives of those that are in here, the late Tim Keller. Uncommon Ground: Living Faithfully in a World of Difference. He's the founder of the Carver Project and Legal Vocation Fellowship, and the co-convener of the New Begin Fellows and Evangelicals in Diverse Democracy. This is something that you may not know about John, and we're going to probe this in a little bit. Prior to law teaching, Inazu clerked for Judge Roger Woolman of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit and served for 4 years as an associate general counsel with the Department of Air Force at the Pentagon. If you want to follow him more, you'll hear more information of how you can do that. But most importantly, he has a beautiful wife, Caroline. They're celebrating 20 years of marriage, and they have 3 beautiful children: Lauren, Hannah, and Sam. Help me welcome John Inazu. So John, we've got a lot of room to cover, and so all of you know, write down your questions as we're talking, because in about 44 minutes we're going to have an opportunity to be able to do some listening together. But I want to ask you, take us back to some of the formative things that have shaped who you are. I know we could go back to birth and all of that, but maybe we could pick up a little time and share with us a little bit about your professional journey, and start maybe with why law, why curious, John? What has kind of driven you into these spaces?
Yeah, thanks. First, I should say it's great to be here back at Upper House. I was here 7 years ago talking about an earlier book and have known John and the team for a while, and we've benefited much from the work and ministry you all are doing here. It's always fun to be here, and thanks, Ed, for doing this with me. So in terms of sort of my professional development, it was very nonlinear. I went to college. Well, my parents, we were living in Colorado, and they said, you can go somewhere in Colorado and we'll pay for it, or you can figure out how to pay for college. And I did not want to go to school in Colorado. So I ended up pursuing ROTC. And the upside of that was that they paid for all of college. The downside for me was that I was required to major in engineering. And about 2 weeks into school, decided that engineering wasn't for me. But was sort of stuck with it. I went to Duke and really fell in love both with InterVarsity and the local church there, and had this rich community of friends a few months into my freshman year. And so I thought I could leave this community and go study something I want, or stick it out with engineering, which is what I did. So 4 years later, I had a begrudgingly had a civil engineering degree and a great experience from Duke, and law school was simply an escape hatch from engineering. I knew nothing about the law. I'd never talked to a lawyer, had no lawyers in the family. I just knew it wasn't engineering. And
Real deep discernment.
yeah,
through the
there was
process
not a
of,
lot of discernment at the time. So I had to have the Air Force agree to this, but they agreed to delay my service so I could go to law school, and was back at Duke for law school. Week one of law school, some friends I knew in the area came up and they said, "We need a guitar player for our local Young Life team, and we know you play the guitar, so would you do that?" And I thought, well, law school is supposed to be really hard, but I really love Young Life, so I joined the team, and eventually, or shortly thereafter, was the team leader. So I spent most of law school doing Young Life ministry, which is a very poor way to do law school. And when I advise students now, I usually tell them, do not do what I did. It was a wonderful time with Young Life, and still some of my closest friendships. But I was a very mediocre law student. And toward the end of law school, assumed that the Air Force was going to go send me to be a JAG somewhere, which is sort of the typical path for military lawyers. And I got a last minute call, and they said, "Hey, we've got this program at the Pentagon. No one's ever heard of it. We want you to come interview. And then you could choose 4 years in DC or roll the dice and end in Minot, North Dakota, or somewhere, you know." And so it was pretty clear that DC was the better option. So I ended up, and it was a great first job, 4 years in DC at the Pentagon, a lot of responsibility out of the gates. And toward the end of that time, that was when I really first discovered I loved the law, and I was pretty good at it as a practitioner, as a litigator, as a counselor. And also it was just so fast paced all the time. And so I thought maybe wired to be more reflective. And so at the age of 29, for the first time, I thought about teaching law, which is a very atypical path. And I was quite under credentialed. So in my case, I was very fortunate enough to clerk for a judge, then went back and did a PhD, UNC Chapel Hill. Along the way, joined a church staff and was the high school youth pastor for a couple of years, which was great and hard and wonderful. And then was very fortunate to end up with this job at Washington University, where I've been for 13 years. So that's the professional
wow.
journey.
You mentioned the Pentagon. I'm just interested in that season, taking the arc of learning to disagree
Yeah.
and looking at some of the things of confident pluralism. Can you help us see your lens back at that time, young John, leader? Was there anything that took place during that season where you're like, this is for me, but something different is coming?
Yeah, a couple of things. Uh, I've told some people over the years that I was um, almost a pacifist at the time, which is a hard role to have at the Pentagon. And
Extremely hard.
I've never quite fully been a pacifist, but I'm persuaded by a lot of those arguments, and so it was hard sometimes to be in the building. And I made kind of a personal decision that I would not. I did a lot of sort of contract litigation and advising of systems, and I decided for myself I was not going to work on any direct weapon systems, but I worked on the planes that flew above the weapon systems, and I worked at the Air Force Academy training the people who were going to fly the systems. So, you know, you could poke holes in the lines that I was drawing. But I think one thing that I was just struck by in my time there was how quickly fear and anxiety would translate to military power and aggression. And you know, I'm deeply grateful for this country, and especially for the men and women who serve in uniform, including still many of my classmates and friends. But the just the sense, almost the human instinct that we're going to protect ourselves with military might, and we're going to respond with force when threatened, is not always a good one. And I felt that I was in the Pentagon on 9/11, which I write about some in the book, and that was obviously a transformative and hard time. As difficult, I think, was watching the weeks and months after that time, when uniformly the response was, we have to go fight and kill people in response to this attack. And you know, a lot of bad things happened in response to that time. It doesn't mean you don't do anything, right? And this is
Sure.
why I'm not a pacifist, but it does mean that it felt like a very precarious time there. The other thing that just comes to mind as you ask the question is and those of you who remember back to 9/11, there was this blip of unity. It didn't
Yeah.
last very long, but it was there. The entire U.S. Congress assembled on the steps of the Capitol and sang "God Bless America" together. I mean, that sounds like out of a movie, right? Like that would happen. And I remember President Bush came to the Pentagon the week of the attack, and it just was this very powerful, moving time, and kids were sending in pictures to hang on the walls. Like all the walls were just covered with smoke and soot, and these little kids' pictures with God Bless America and stuff like that. But that kind of almost innocent unity quickly became, we have to go get the enemy, and then that's what unified us. And then soon thereafter, we were sort of back to our normal political fracture. So it was sort of a very powerful and visceral reminder of our desire for unity and how good it can feel, but also how quickly we can attach it to maybe some of the wrong things.
Hmm. One of the things that has stood out to me in the friendship with you and conversation is you have a genuine curiosity. Um, I want to use a sample of a low grade story to take it next level. But John has a legacy on the InterVarsity board. A few years ago, we were having a conversation, and if John's hand goes up in the meeting, you know that it's going to be a good question, but it's probably going to drive us deeper into whatever it is. So he raises his hand and he said, "Hey, why do we dress up for board meetings?" You remember this?
Oh yeah,
And
this is my
he's like,
greatest legacy with InterVarsity, by
"Yes."
the way.
And so the history up to that point were took it up a notch. Shirt and tie, blazer. The ladies were elegantly dressed, and he said, "Hey, why not have a polo shirt and a nice pair of jeans?" And John's questioning prevailed, and now we have casual dress. Uh, but as I think about it, it took me back to something that when you're talking about disagreeing, can you talk about the role of asking questions and curiosity? Because you do that fairly
Hmm.
normally, and I'm just curious, where does that come from, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I love that you brought up the jeans illustration, because in some ways what predicated the question, I mean, other than I like jeans, obviously, um, was walking into the board meeting and feeling like the tone of everybody dressed very proper was, I mean, I was asking a culture question. Does this reflect the culture of InterVarsity? Who might this alienate rather than bring into a meeting or a conversation? And with doing something as simply as changing the norm or the code or even the soft rule, would that maybe help some things? And so it was the kind of question that was wondering, what questions aren't we asking in some ways?
Yeah.
And for me, I think part of that is just having been raised as someone who is, you and I have talked about this over the years, but always a little bit outside of whatever the majority norm is, or whoever is calling the shots. It's usually not squarely me. I mean, I'm often in positions where I can have influence or people will listen, but I'm not often at the center of the power. And so I think about being raised. Dad is Japanese, and so being raised as a Japanese American in a military culture and a largely white culture, and what that meant as to be not fully white in some of those settings, to
Yeah.
be the almost pacifist at the Pentagon, to be a Christian faculty member at a very non-Christian university, and a Christian faculty at a church that is often skeptical of what those universities are doing. So a lot of these just kind of postures in life have helped me um, raise some questions, because whenever you're sort of part of the assumed baseline, you don't have to ask the questions, because other people have to ask the questions around you to understand you.
Mm.
But if you're not quite sure where or how you fit in, asking good questions and appropriate questions can be a useful skill, sometimes a survival skill, but sometimes something that can help. And you can't do it, I think it also ties to a an ability to ask questions uh, smartly, but not aggressively, right? In a way,
Mm-hmm.
strategically is the word I was looking for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not to ask them not to try to blow something up, but to try to nudge at how might this be a little better or a little different.
Yeah. It seems like when we talk about difficult things, we have such a culture of gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to frame this because I'm trying to actually angle and get you in a place where your defenses are either down or to humiliate the other side versus this goal of reconciliation, to learn, to understand. I'm curious in the academy, how have you been challenged to enter into and actually practically use this on the college campus? Because we love universities um,
Yeah.
very much. And for the faculty here, thank you so much. We really love you. But how do you use this in kind of daily life at WashU and some of the things that you've done?
Well, I mean, so this makes me think back to the Young Life experience. I feel like I sometimes tell people that I learned all of my social skills in Young Life, and I, like faculty generally, and I love faculty obviously, but we're very, generally speaking, low on social skills and high on ego, and that's a very it's a very bad combination.
It's not
And
what I was thinking,
and
John, but yes, there's some
but
truth in that.
and then when you try to like bring all those people together to run an institution, it can be really hard. And so I think just trying to slow things down, even something like super normal, like when you have a new committee meeting that's meeting for the first time, start with getting to know people instead of just jump. I mean, people, this is not a normal or natural impulse of a lot of faculty. So are there ways to slow down and work on relationships first? This ties in directly to the principles in this book, which is that the hard stuff is not going to work out very well unless you have a base of common ground and trust and just ordinariness. I mean, if
Yeah.
you just, this is why social media is so pernicious, because you jump online with someone, you have no idea who they are, there's no context to a relationship, you're just sort of yelling at each other quickly. And the same thing offline, if you don't take the time to invest in any sort of relationship, then it's going to be very difficult to go deep in a way that's healthy um, or encouraging in any sense. And so I remember when I first got to Washington University as a first year professor, and I just told myself walking into this faculty, my job here is to win friendships, not arguments. The arguments will come. We're gonna have lots of fun disagreements. This is what we were in these jobs to disagree and to sharpen each other's arguments, but we have to first form friendships. And so I worked on that, just did a lot of lunches and a lot of coffees, and that was great. And for the most part, really love my colleagues. We're friends. We have vast differences, but we're committed to a common enterprise. We can talk more about later whether that enterprise is fully coherent. I think not,
Right.
but at least we're trying to do something together, and we have a respect for one another despite our differences. And I'm not sure we ever would have gotten there had we just jumped in and started arguing.
Agreed. Agreed. So the book, Learning to Disagree, even by the phrase learning,
Mm-hmm.
that we haven't arrived yet, but you chose to do something very interesting. For those that haven't read the book, you, instead of having chapter numbers, you used the year and months, the way you framed that. Take us into a little bit of why you framed it that way, and took us, if you will, into the academic year.
Yeah, great. So when this book kind of started to come together, which it was the height of the pandemic, and we were socially distanced, and everyone was yelling at each other online about the different COVID policies, and I thought there's got to be a healthier way to come out of this. I mean, I think the pandemic reminded a lot of people, regardless of your faith background, just intrinsically and viscerally, that human beings are supposed to be together with each other. And it was very hard not to be together. But in the coming together, how do you do that in a healthy way? How do you disagree well when you have these big differences? And so two things occurred to me. One, the classes that I teach criminal law and law and religion, and they raise these host of very hard, divisive issues, culture war issues, issues where people have lots of personal experience, whether it's with uh, family members and mass incarceration or sexual assault, but hard questions that get to the core of who we are and how we navigate punishment and these really difficult concepts, and that in taking a reader through a year of law teaching, I could kind of sneak in lessons through storytelling of what it's like to engage with these in the classroom, how you navigate student questions, how you navigate a diverse student body who are going to come at things from different ways, and try to lead them into a common understanding of why these issues are really hard. And then as part of that narrative that unfolds over the course of a year, also being able to tell what basically amounts to all of my own personal failure stories, right? So I'm teaching these lofty principles in the classroom, and then I go out to see my family or meet a friend or encounter the local bureaucracy, and I just blow it in my own, my own sort of efforts toward patience and understanding and respect. And so I can tell stories about successive failures, which then takes us to the title, learning,
Yeah.
the ongoing active work that's never quite done, right? This is not like how you master disagreement, or you or I. It's that we are constantly learning, we're falling short, we're picking ourselves back up and trying again. And there's never going to be a point, especially in such a diverse and conflicted society, there's never going to be a point where we just kind of wake up and say, you know what, I got it. I just nailed it today and I'm done. Like I can just, so we're just going to keep working on it, however imperfectly, and hopefully guiding each other along the way.
I'm just curious. This next question, the audience is going to help give you a little bit of scientific data. But how many of you, under the sound of my voice, would say, I'm an empathetic person? Just by a show of hands. That's astounding. That's more, I think, than I've ever. Can you just put your hands up again? I just wanted to, I almost want to take a photo. Either this is truth or dare. So
I'm also noticing whose hands are down.
yes, that's right. So for the 13 of those that are not, I'm just curious. You in chapter 1, you really spend time laying a foundation of empathy and patience, and then in a little bit we're going to talk about forgiveness. I thought that was an interesting place to go later in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us about why is empathy so significant and important for this skill of learning to disagree?
Yeah, and I should first observe. I mean, and I would also raise my hand as one of those who is empathetic. My hunch is we tend to think of ourselves probably better than we are. Right? Probably everyone in this room thinks that you're part of the reasonable people in society,
Right,
and
yeah,
the
right.
other people, and
It's
yet,
the other
right,
people
right,
that are.
right. And so we probably all have maybe more work to do than we might recognize or admit, but at least the aspirational goal of empathy. And I frame this around law and law teaching because my pitch here is that even though lawyers, not without reason, are sometimes known as the stubborn people who argue, no matter what, I think the best lawyers learn this skill of empathy. And part of empathy is figuring out how to fully understand as best as possible the other side of an argument, its best possible case, come up with all the possible counter objections to your own position, understand why someone holds the argument, not just that they hold it, but why they hold it. Where does it come from? What experiences or perspectives might shape their views? Because at the end of the day, you've got to take the two arguments before a judge or other decision maker. And if you go in there and say, those people are stupid and evil and we're the right ones, that's rarely going to be persuasive. What you have to do is say, here's a very hard issue, complex, dicey, lots of gray. Here's this side has a good argument. We have a better one. And here's why you should listen to us. And that's how you persuade people in society. And that's how you work toward social change in a long-term way. And that's good lawyering. And that's part of what empathy is. But then the other piece of empathy that I try to foreground in the book is there are going to be limits to our ability to empathize. So there's a kind of humility that comes with our understanding of empathy, which is to say, we will not always fully step into someone else's shoes. And the differences that between us as unique human beings, but also from our own experiences, different racial backgrounds, different, lots of things that factor into how we navigate and understand the world that are going to limit our ability to empathize. That's okay. And it's sometimes really helpful to recognize that we're not going to get there fully in this lifetime. And rather than just assume or assert that, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about, because often we don't and we won't.
just to go a little further with that, we wrestled with this over dinner a month ago, where we were talking about this dichotomy of speaking truthfully and speaking charitably. And of course, we're sitting in the Midwest. We have Midwest nice. In the South, we have bless your heart. Uh, there's a lot of different ways that we engage in conversation. But I'm curious. Can you talk about the tension of those two, speaking truthfully and speaking charitably?
You know, I,
Help
I
us with
think
that.
there might be an asymmetry to those charges, or as Christians we might also say speak the truth in love. I think we're always called to speak out of love, and sometimes we are called to proclaim truth. I mean, so
Mm,
but what I'm not saying is it's okay to lie. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is you don't always have to be God's spokesperson all the time for every single issue that comes across your plate. And some of us think that we are, right? Like when you're like if you think like the Holy Spirit is telling you you've got to respond on social media to that outrageous comment, pray a little more because maybe God doesn't need you to be doing that. And and so that's not living untruthfully. It's just being discerning and prudential about when to speak truth. But whenever you do speak truth, speak it in love, speak it charitably. And um, sometimes what we need more is the charitable engagement. And so
mm.
one story that comes to mind as we're talking, it's not in the book. It kind of, as with much of my life, it happened after I wrote the book, and then I thought, oh, this would have fit well here. Um, I was I was talking to my daughter who's about to turn 17, and we got into a pretty heated discussion over a political issue, and she was making some points that were, she was making them from the perspective of a very smart almost 17-year-old, but emphasis on almost 17, right? She didn't have all the data, and so I was starting to engage with her, and I kind of went into law professor mode, and so I started critiquing some of her arguments and telling her when she was overclaiming, and letting her know she hadn't consulted XYZ sources. And we were in a room, and I had my glasses off, so I actually couldn't see her fully. And my wife walked into the room and started listening. And then as I was like going into my objections, she said, just so you know, she's over there crying. And it was this like just immediate recognition that it didn't matter if I was speaking truth or not. I had misunderstood my role in the moment, which was to be dad, not law professor. So it didn't matter how right I was or how brilliant my arguments might have been. I had botched the entire relationship because of a misunderstood role and because of truth without love, especially in the context of what was going on. And so it was a very kind of profound and personal
Yeah.
recognition of that deficit in my own life, and but maybe also a reminder of you don't always have to, uh, you know, be the person speaking truth all the time. Sometimes you're just called to be in relationship.
Yeah. And was really humbling about that is that was in the context of relationship.
Yeah, yeah,
Think about how many
right.
times we have these conversations where we don't have relationship, or we're in the workplace and it's an acquaintance but not really a friend, and we get caught up so often in this concept of fairness. And you've really helped me think about this quite a bit, and we've all used it. It's not fair. We need to have fairness in this conversation, but I'm just curious, if you're wrestling with the definition of what is fair, how does the law help inform us about what fairness is?
So fairness is one of those words that when you think about it, nobody's actually against fairness, right? Just like nobody's against justice. We throw out these arguments, with our adversaries and say, well, they're the anti-justice crowd. Everybody wants fairness. Everybody wants justice. We disagree about what those mean and what our
Yes.
baselines are. And so from that perspective, we criticize the other side. But we all, as human beings, we see injustice and unfairness and harm in the world, and we want those things to be righted. And one of the things the law helps us see is one, that's really hard, and two, it's not going to happen. So it's really hard because trying to get something as fair as possible is at best a proxy or a judgment call. So that when think about a criminal sentencing, for example. Someone has done a bad thing to someone else. What should the punishment be? Well, when you start to ask those questions, well, what were the circumstances? What's the background of the offender? Who was the person harmed? How much, what disruption did it cause? And even if you could get that right, then you're on to the next case. And then you ask, well, how is this sentence over here fair relative to the one that we arrived at last week? And how do you hold those fair across perspectives? It's impossible. And then you poke even deeper and you realize, and no matter what you do, there will always be a remainder of harm or injustice that exists in the world. So if you lose someone to a violent crime, there is no punishment, no recompense that's going to come from the law or any other place in society that's going to make you wake up and say, well, it's all just now, right? Justice has been served. That it hasn't. There is the injustice remains, and law helps us see the limits of what we can do as human beings in a world where inevitably we are going to keep hurting each other day after day, week after week. There are going to be massive injustices in the world. It's part of the human condition until Christ comes again. We are stuck with this world of injustice. The law also reminds us it's a very good thing to work toward proximate justice. I would much rather have this system where we try our best to get it right than a system that lets us resolve our disputes through street violence, where the vulnerable will be even more punished and neglected. So I'm grateful for a law that does this, but we ought to think of it as at best proximate justice that is sometimes going to get it wrong, that is not going to be fair by any cosmic sense of the word, and that is often going to leave us disappointed and frustrated.
That's really good. One of the things that I think that is often challenging is how to have and when to know how to have a difficult conversation. And I know we probably have many different faith traditions that are here today. I'm so glad that we could be together in this place. Uh, for those of us that come from Christian tradition, we have some really weird people in our family. I mean, God loves all, but some people are just harder. Am I right? I mean, just some people are just harder to love. The extra grace required people, uh, and so when you start to think about that, I'm just curious. Can you share how to know when to have a difficult conversation, and quite frankly, there are times where you shouldn't.
Yeah, so one of the points I try to make is I think these conversations are possible, but the context really matters, and you do need
Say more about that.
discernment
That's
of
I
when
was
to
hoping you were going to
when
go
to
there.
find the right context. I think you don't even have to go out as far as to a church family or a religious family or a neighborhood. Just start with your own extended family. Like for most of us, that's really hard, and it's
Thanksgiving
and we
dinner.
think we think like we're gonna yeah, we think this is why those situations are just set up to fail, because at least one person in your extended family is going to come in with completely unrealistic expectations of how the whole weekend should go, right? The food should look a certain way. People should be happy the whole time. And, and I mean, and there's a lot riding on those gatherings already. So why in the world would you superimpose additional pressure by saying, let's have a really hard conversation around like this guy, we're flying in, we're tired, like maybe you're bringing little kids and someone's been cooking a long time and everyone wants it to go well, and then you say like, let's talk about politics, that sounds terrible. So this Thanksgiving, how about don't do that, like just enjoy each other's company and talk about sports. And if you deeply care about a political, religious, or other rift in a close family relationship, and if you're not with that person, fully in the same community, then don't take the opportunity of that high stakes holiday reunion to dump it all on the table. Like, fly out to see them and say like, let's have a conversation some other time. Because I think I hear a lot of my students and friends will say things like about a family member, I feel like I don't even know this person anymore.
Mm.
And the truth is they don't even know this person anymore, because you might have had a whole lifetime of shared experiences, raised in the same family, but the last few years have been spent in different environments with different media and social media formation, and different lived experiences. And you're going to, and probably, especially if you've moved away and you're in different geographic locations, you haven't been living life together. And you've lost that common ground that we were talking about at the beginning of our discussion. And so to think that you can come in and just kind of go right at it in that hard discussion is not a recipe for success. So if you really care about the relationship, start by asking yourself, what does it take to recommit to reestablishing the common ground? And it might take a long time. So play a long game. And so I mentioned, I lay all this out, and then I say, and of course I failed to follow my own advice. So a few years ago, I went home to Colorado, and my dad and I got into one of these political conversations, and it did not go well. And we stopped talking to each other for a year. And a year is a very long time as kids are growing up and life is happening. And it was hard and really painful. And in our case, what triggered our eventual reconciliation was his cancer diagnosis. And my mom called and said, you know, Dad has just been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And it was like in a very quick moment, I just realized, well, we gotta try now. So I started going home quite frequently and visiting, and we both uh, realized we needed to start talking again. And we eventually got to some of the hard issues, but more than that, it was just the reminder or the lesson learned that you can really have, even in ruptured relationships, you can start to have those hard conversations again, and maybe especially when you realize that there isn't a whole lot of time left to have them. So I think in some ways that's it's obviously a super personal and a somewhat limited example, except that unless a whole bunch of us start working to do this better in very personal individual relationships, we're not going to see the kind of social change that we're looking for.
So when differences collide, and oftentimes we hear this phrase, sometimes I think we say it too early. Hey, we're just going to agree to disagree about this. And I'm like, well, that was an interesting statement. We're going to agree to disagree. We've only been talking for 10 minutes, but we're going to agree to disagree on this. When do you know when to stop, or when do you know when to keep going?
Yeah, I love the phrase. We're going to agree to disagree because 90% of the time it's passive aggressive, right? Like so,
Yeah,
you don't,
it's
you're
true.
just you're really just trying to stop the conversation, or you don't really. Uh, there's not a lot of mutual respect in that moment, and this is why. Back to the title of the book, it's not achieving consensus; it's learning to disagree with the presumption that there's going to be ongoing disagreement, and it's going to take work. And to me, the what we're conveying by the words agreeing to disagree, or that it's almost like we're going to go to our sides and stop communicating, or at least limit our communication. But what I'm trying to suggest with learning to disagree is we have to be having an ongoing conversation. It doesn't mean you always bring up every hard issue between people, but you're going to keep it as part of your relationship because it's part of the world, and sometimes it'll surface, and sometimes you'll have to remember to talk through things in a new way. Um, Now, there are going to be some limits to this, and there is a walk away time for some people when there's a power asymmetry in a relationship. I mean, if you're just being berated or you find that your own like mental health is at stake here, you don't have to be a martyr in every situation, and you don't have to be the person reaching out across the aisle in every single relationship of your life. So have some judgment, have some friends around you to tell you when, to kind of um, take a break or prioritize different relationships. So this is not sort of like a mantra to every person you encounter. You need to learn to disagree, but within those natural and trusted relationships in your life, sometimes the problem is not so much that you need to figure out how to say things better and more carefully, but for some people, it's you need the courage actually to speak in the first instance or to raise the issue that you know is dividing you, but you're too afraid to mention. And at some point, if you're really doing the work of trust building and friendship, at some point that trust is going to be there. And some of us are just called to take more risks in those moments, I think.
Yeah. Your book helped me. I had a conversation with my dad 2 weeks ago,
Mhm.
a decades long conflict. And in the middle of the conversation, we realized that the entire thing was built on a misunderstanding of a phrase that he heard from my wife. And we just, you're like, what? Really? I mean, I now I probably responded a little differently because I did say, "Really, Daddy? Is that? I mean, is that what you? That had nothing to do with, but literally 30 some years. There's this. It began early, but 25 years of really walking into something, and I think that there's something about leaning in to learn and listen for understanding versus being heard that you model so well. And I'm just curious. This is a question for me. This is completely off script. I just I'm curious if you could have a difficult conversation with anyone in history. Who would you like to sit down and have a conversation with? Living or dead?
That's a really on the spot hard question. Yeah. I mean, and
Thank
I
you.
always, yeah.
Thank
So
you. I work at that.
there's
I'm
no
good
way
at
I'm
it.
going to come up with the answer, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, an answer. Um, maybe Harry Truman about dropping the atomic bombs.
Yeah. Yeah. If I could mine for that a little bit,
Yeah.
there's clearly something that's happened that changed the course of human history. But what's the prior question of trust that you would want to probe with him?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know. Does he play golf? Like, let's. I mean, yeah, we'd have to. Yeah, this is why I like the question as sort of an abstract, get to know you question, but
Yeah.
in a practical sense, it would have to be what does the ordinary relationship look like, right? And this is why I mean the very best journalists, when you see these brilliant interviews, they have a sort of a sixth sense about how to create a tone that leads to both authenticity and trust in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Most of us are not very good at that.
Yeah.
So most of us actually need a lot of prior relationship. And if I were sitting down with Harry Truman, I would need, a couple of days to figure out like how do we build trust in an ordinary sense before we talk about like your decision to annihilate a lot of human lives,
Yeah.
right, for reasons that you thought were just.
Yeah.
That's a hard set of questions. I wouldn't want to start there. I'd want to
Sure.
start with like, what kind of beer do you like, or what.
Yeah. Yeah. And yet it's really interesting. We say we want to move toward agreement, but we have structures and ideologies and even our nationality and ethnicity that keeps us from even sitting down with people we vehemently disagree with.
Yeah, and I'm actually not sure that the goal is to move toward agreement, right? And I actually think our disagreements are so profound
Yeah.
and they're so entrenched and they're not going to get any easier or go away. So the goal should just be learning disagreement, I think. Now, in the midst of that, we as a country especially, we still have to find something that holds us together and unifies us, and that is a very hard and very elusive question. At the smaller level, the institutional level, good leaders and good institutions can cast a vision that says this is what unites us, and we can be people who disagree quite a bit, but in the context of Upper House or the University of Wisconsin or InterVarsity Christian Fellowship or name your institution, this is who we are, this is the we, this is our mission, and this is what binds and constrains us. So you as an individual might have lots of views out here, or maybe you think this person over here inside the institution holds ideals that you think are misguided and even harmful, but for the purposes of our collective work within the institution, this is the we, and this is how we're going to agree. Now it gets much harder when you step outside of institutions and say, how do you apply that to America? Very hard
Right.
question
Right.
right now.
There's a question I'd like to ask, and then we're gonna start to pivot toward your questions. But you end the book in a way that I think is profound, especially for those uh, of the faith tradition of Christianity, you bring up forgiveness. And I just thought it was interesting the way that you brought it up is through the lens of a story with a student who, frankly, you had given up on. I'm just curious, can you tell us about that story and why is forgiveness a key to this concept of learning to disagree?
Yeah, so so the characters in this book outside of me and my immediate family are composite characters to protect the innocent and the guilty, and because I didn't want to write about specific students or specific colleagues, but I do have these composite characters that are built on real students, and in this particular case, I sometimes supervise independent studies, which are semester or year long extended research topics that take a ton of time and a ton of feedback, and you develop a relationship with students over time. And there have been students along the way who I feel really blessed to teach students who are brilliant and hardworking, but some of them are quite stubborn. And sometimes I realize I'm working closely with a student in one of these contexts, and they're very smart, they're great writers, but they're just so entrenched into their own views, they're not open to learning. And so I'm telling the story of this student over the course of a year who is demonstrating this brilliance, but also this just inability to learn anything. And at the very end of the year, she surprises me by finally getting it. And much like I had given up on her. I just thought, I know what she's going to turn in. I know how this is going to look, and we're going to be done. But she gets it, and she does a brilliant, but also nuanced paper that I didn't think she was capable of. So I'm discussing this in the context of forgiveness to say, I had to do, I had sort of prejudged her, and I realized I needed more grace with her. And then at the same time, I needed a little more grace with myself too, to recognize I screwed up and I still have something to learn here. And the way this ties a bit into forgiveness, I think, is the recognition that we are, as a predicate to being to having forgiveness work in society, we need people who both recognize their own need for forgiveness and recognize their own capacity to be forgiven. And unless you have both of those, it's going to be very hard to work out forgiveness on a social or civil level. And it's really needed because, back to the point about fairness, we are going to keep hurting, harming, and committing injustices against each other, especially in a complex, diverse society. We're going to screw it up, and we're going to have lots of moments and needs and opportunities for forgiveness. And we need people who are formed and cultivated into the habits that allow them to see that possibility. And then I would just say it is the only possibility that lets you reimagine a different future that is otherwise stuck in all of the weight and the burdens of the injustices and harms that remain.
Friends, help me thank author and friend John Inazu